In this part of the DVD, we'll look at how to check on the health of your spat, how to see if there is a problem, tips on using a microscope, measuring growth, and estimating mortality.
A lot of us become aware that there's a problem when there's no increase in volume, so no growth. Also, when we look at the screens, there's no faeces sitting on top of the oysters, which usually occurs. They generally appear lighter in colour. You may be able to see the gaping by eye when they're larger, and also more gaping oysters will mean that they'll lighten in colour because the soft tissue has been removed and the shells lighten, and the presence of empty shells. Now, as we've heard already before, these things grow exceptionally quickly. They also die exceptionally quickly, and the soft tissue rapidly vanishes, and also the shell will disintegrate very quickly and just fall through, and it's just lost. And it's very hard to detect that without examination of the stock. And that's close examination. Really, you need a microscope. A good microscope is just a basic stereo dissecting microscope that has a magnification of 20 to 40 times. What is also essential for tracking growth is a little piece that you insert in the eyepiece, and it's just a ruler that your eye can pick up as you look down the microscope, and it's called an eyepiece graticule. And these range in price from anywhere between $50 and $250, but we're happy to help you track down a reasonably priced one. So for a setup like this, you're looking at about $400. Aquasonic is a good supplier, and I noticed this week on their website they have this exact microscope for about $260. That's sort of the price range you're looking at for a microscope that'll do the job quite adequately.
Using a microscope and a graticule, you can easily inspect the growth, health and mortality of spat samples, and it only takes around 15 minutes a day. To take a sample for examination, use a wide mouth pipette or scrape the spat up with a Petri dish. We've improvised this pipette from a 10mm pipette tip with the end cut off, and the bulb off a solder sucker from Dick Smith's. You can buy similar ones ready-made from scientific suppliers. You'll need a few samples of 50 to 100 spat for checking under the microscope. Before we measure them, we check the spat's colour. Lighter spat may indicate a problem.
There's not a great difference in colour across this whole sample. So we find a spot on our Petri dish or when we're looking down the microscope so there's fewer, just to make it more simpler to do our measurements. And what we do, we just shift the sample around the microscope and we take measurements of the axis that goes from the hinge up to the shell end. And so we take 30 to 40 measurements along that axis, because that axis increases fastest to gauge growth. And doing that every day, you'll see the growth stepping up. Wayne mentioned before how quickly they put on shell fringe. And here we can see the shell fringe of a spat here that's been put on quite rapidly. We know that because it just hasn't had a chance to be rubbed off. Rapid development of shell fringe is an excellent indicator of health of the spat. They're putting a lot of their energy into growing their shell. So looking for that new shell growth around the edge. It's a much darker where all the soft tissue is, and then it's new shell frill. When the spat is smaller from the nursery, we can actually see through it using a microscope. The light is transmitted through, and we can actually see parts of their soft tissue. And here you can see the gill arch. We can see the mantle just extruding out from the edge of the shell. But in assessing health, we want to see activity. And a great place to look for activity is both on the gills. On the gills they have tiny beating cilia, so you'll see this rapid movement, and you can even see food particles being pushed along the gills. It's a very rapid way to detect that your spat are firstly alive and they're processing food and they're happy. After they've sat on the microscope stage for a little while, they'll extend their mantle edge out from the shell where they're actually sensing the environment around them, and you'll see this movement from the shell fringe. This spat is a lot lighter. The colour of spat is a really good indicator of health. Generally darker spat means they've just got a heavier shell, but if they're lightening, that means that there could be a problem. This one you can actually see it gaping. It's not gaping because it's dead, it's gaping because it's feeding. But The lighter shell allows us to see the soft tissue detail a lot better. We've got the gut, which sits in the back. We've got the gill here, which you can see, that's where you'll observe a lot of activity. Once again, the same thing with darker spat, we can just make out the gill arch, but you can see how far they'll extend their mantle from the shell. Another thing you want to do is assess mortality, and basically you can do that by distinguishing light shell with no soft tissue in it versus the shell that has that's darker, that's closed, and that has the soft tissue in it. And when they're smaller, you can actually see the movement, as I mentioned before. But you want to basically get about 50 in a field of view and physically count all of the spat that you can see. You then go back, don't move the sample, you count all of the dead shell that you can see, and then that'll give you a mortality estimate. You don't want to do it once, because where you take the spat off the screen initially, you may have congregated a lot of the dead shell into one spot. So you want to do this a number of times across different screens, and you want to do it at different size grades, and probably repeat the exercise, particularly if you see a problem. If there's a lot of dead shell, you'd want to confirm that it's only restricted to one screen, not throughout different size grades, so you'd check other size grades. So what I was hopefully wanting to do now, and if technology will allow me, is just to quickly put a sample up onto the microscope that I know has a bit of dead shell. And using a microscope, you'll get a much better image than this. But what we've got here is a spat that's retained on 500 micron. We can see that these are really transparent because of their size. You can see that there's a dark patch adjacent to the hinge, and that's the algae sitting in their gut. But just in here, there's a bit of very light shell it doesn't have this dark base. And so that's basically dead oyster that we're looking at there. You can see this one here extending its mantle frill. This one up here, you can see it's finger waving around. So that's the activity that we want to look for in a sample. So they're open, feeding, and it's a good healthy batch. This dead shell is much, much smaller than the rest of the sample, indicating that that's remnant, and what's happened here, it's come down through the size grades. But what it means is these other oysters have grown on beyond that point where the mortality occurred. And in this sample, it's actually larval shell, so it's spat that never even morphosed, that was swimming, it was larvae that never metamorphosed, swimming around and eventually dies. So that's why we're seeing it in this sample, and by our grading, we just concentrate it to this point. So by doing this rapid health check initially, when you get the spat, you'll know what mortality is coming over from the hatchery. As soon as you get the stock, just take a subsample, throw it under the microscope and have a quick look, write down the mortality. And doing this process, you'll see if it's creeping up or the mortality lessens as the soft tissue disintegrates and the shell disintegrates and is removed from the screens.